I'm not really sure because I think a big part of that is the skill of the writer. Because even if you have the best themes in the world or whatever it might be, even if you know exactly what you want to convey, you might not be good at doing it. You might not be good at telling a story that people are willing to accept that you're fictionalizing
Yeah.
reality, that you're making something up. I'm not always sure why people accept it or not. You could poorly write Harry Potter and you could think it's ridiculous, but
Yeah.
something about the way authors write makes it more appealing. We could speculate if it was, say, they're showing essential as well, as in they're clarifying what it is they want to talk about, or they're showing in a concrete way what something you can grasp onto, that
Yeah.
you can at least make some abstract connection with it. That even with Harry Potter with magic, you know it's a story about, say, somebody growing up through their life as an individual. I mean, it could be very abstract, but I think it could be realistic in the sense that as an artist, the people, for whatever reason, are able to recognize what essential points you're making, or they can recognize the essentials that you're displaying, and they are interested in that, probably interested in that portrayal of an essential. Like this concrete is appealing because maybe it appeals to their sense of life, or it seems more about the essential, which takes a lot of artistic skill to display it right. I think that's a lot of it, that once you learn as an artist to display the essential things you want to, the essential ideas, people are more willing to accept these fantasies you've created.
Okay. Um, yeah, I mean, I guess it applies. I don't know if these are all the same issues, but take, for example, some of Francisco's speeches in Atlas Shrugged, where
Yeah,
he talks for like multiple pages. Like, no one would have an actual dialogue like that in life, right? And unless
yeah,
someone is making a speech, that's not, if you meet a friend, he's not going to, you know, talk, just keep talking for like 30 minutes nonstop. And so you're saying that what makes us accept that and go, oh, this is, and not just reject it as ridiculous, is that we are we are happy to suspend. We don't make those comparisons, and we go, this could be somewhat real, and the essentials, like important essentials, are being shown, so I'm enjoying it. Like I'm able to kind of imagine this conversation were to occur, um, in small driblets over time, but now instead it's just going to all be over 4 pages or something like that. So it's we suspend our judgment, and because it's essentialized, we can sort of imagine that it may play out similar to that, but not exactly. Is that what you meant? Maybe
yeah,
I don't know
something
if
along
I.
those lines, that the essentials, at least the people who would say, the people who do are fine with the disbelief, they're fine with what happened. I think it's usually a matter of the essential. It's hard to say exactly because there's so many psychological factors to take
Yeah.
into account. But if we accept the
Yeah.
idea that an artist shows their sense of life with, or some aspect of their sense of life in a piece of art, by observing it, you will react to that portrayal or attempted portrayal. And I would suspect that the more similar your sense of life is to them, or the more valuable their insights about their own sense of life or their own reaction to the world impacts your way of thinking about the world, it can create interest in it. That, but on the other hand, people might not believe it because they don't think an artist is dealing with concretes in the appropriate way. They might say with Victor Hugo, like, nobody acts this way. This is ridiculous. This is terrible writing. People really
Yeah.
did think that of Victor Hugo. It's
Yeah.
like they can't suspend the disbelief because they don't think art is even a matter of displaying, see, heroism in itself, or displaying something inherently heroic. They want something more. Oh, this is real life in a precise way, or this
Yeah.
is a representation of real life as it is in this heroic thought is just like lowbrow art, if anything.
Yeah. So so it is possible to read, like, maybe this is too theoretical, but let's say someone had a really concrete, both conceptual and concrete understanding of, or concretized understanding of totalitarian governments and the necessity of freedom for innovation. Would they then react? Could they then read something like 1984 or I don't know, any book that shows this like all powerful dictatorship, or like in the movie I watched Equilibrium, like could they react that way and say, oh, this is ridiculous, like it couldn't happen like this? Do you think, is that too much of a stretch?
I would.
Because
It
this
would be
is the
weird to
same
me.
question as evil. It's the same question as like what I brought up about reacting to, you know, the Joker and Batman. And you go, oh, humans aren't like this. This is ridiculous.
Um, I guess it would reflect whatever your reaction is. It reflects what conceptual habits, or even, well, whatever habits or ways of thinking you usually engage in. It's just you react that way. It would reveal
Uh,
something, but
there's
it is hard
something.
to say why, even with among people who agree on a lot of stuff, why they still don't like certain pieces of certain artworks. It's really hard to
This
say.
Okay, there's something wrong with what I'm saying. I think like I think you could react positively even if you didn't think it was believable, because then why else would there be fairy tales? Like, you know, we can
Yeah.
still read ancient fairy tales and people can react to it and appreciate it in some way, right? So I don't
Yes.
really, I don't know what the process is, but I just, that was an observation that's relevant. Because okay, so you can say this isn't realistic but still enjoy it as art.
Yeah, I think so. It depends on what you mean by realistic, but yeah,
Like
I
could
agree with
happen,
that.
could happen.
Yeah, I
That's
agree with
my,
that thinking, at least as far as art with stories in it. Well, yeah, with anything actually, but especially if you're talking about characters or plot elements, their reaction, I think, will always reflect something, some aspect of what they think about art, even as a concept. Like, is art about getting the exact details, which also may reflect how they think about life? Like, do they care about only like these concrete details, or do they really care about these abstract ideas? You could
right.
tell that maybe about your reaction. I think people into abstract ideas can have a, well, you could easily attach onto some other um, broad artwork, or like say, um, trying to think who, say the writer Aaron Sorkin, the screenwriter. He has many movies. He's known for a lot of dialogue. I mentioned him before because he likes poetics by Aristotle, and it really guides his way of.
Oh yeah, you did. Yeah.
But some people think his writing is non-lifelike and irrealistic because nobody has dialogue like this. I mean, yet nobody talks to this in this way he writes the characters. Like, he's all about the dialogue, and even acknowledges people aren't really like this in real life, but that's not what I'm trying to show. Like, he's
Oh,
really trying
okay.
to show something essential about their interaction. He knows he wants to focus on some more abstract element than just I'm recreating conversations in real life. He actually has something thematic going on. There's
Right.
something wider and more conceptual.
Right.
And people could react negatively to that. And to me, it's like, how could you? Like, I don't see anything bad about the way he writes. But people still, some people see it that way, and they're reacting in a way that their sense of life, in a way, impacts even their judgment in the first place, whether it's enjoyable or saying this, no one's like this.
Yeah.
Like, they're rejecting something about the way the art is made, or some display of values. But we could say that I know it's not because Aaron Sorkin focuses on abstractions, because that's what he does. That's the way he writes. So I can at least say they're not reacting to that. And by their own admission, they think it's not realistic. So in a way, they're saying that don't think about the abstracts, just think about the concrete things in front of you. Why worry about the abstract? That's might be the kind of reaction somebody, if somebody thought that way, then yeah, they would say, this is ridiculous. Why would I read this? No one's like this. There's no use for abstractions like this. so I'm not going to bother.
I'm just looking up. So West Wing, A Few Good Men trial. I'm just
Yes.
checking out what he's known for. Okay. Right. Well, that is interesting because if we go by that formulation of art shows what could be, what ought to be, and what could be, in a sense, it's not true absolutely. Like, it doesn't mean this is exactly how people could talk. Am I right in saying that? Or they could talk like that. It's just not, that's not how people talk. I'm just trying to apply that formulation to what you're saying of like,
Yeah, I think it's too narrowly applied to literature. I don't always like using that phrasing. But
okay.
yeah, it could make sense to say that they are saying how man ought to be, an ideal, some abstraction, something broader than a mere concrete. But I think that's more what it reflects. But it is important to remember that's Rand's literary view on art. Like,
Right.
It's not necessarily the same for be with music or anything else like that.
Right.
Or painting. You
Right.
might have to take into account different considerations since they're not characters or individuals. So it's harder to evaluate that.
Mm. Okay. What was the, going back to the movie Equilibrium? What's up with this Tetragrammaton? It was also in Borges. He's always using all these like terms, and yeah. Anyway,
I think
clerics.
The religious connotation.
Okay.
It's a really, I think it has to do with Kabbalah.
Okay.
That's
all right.
why.
They're
And of
all
course, there's the
referenced.
clerics and all that.
Yeah. And they go to monasteries.
4-letter Hebrew word for God.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Because the leader is like God and he wants people to obey
it's a
him.
word for
all
God.
Right. All right. Cool. I will get into this document. Oh, by the way, I was reviewing, we were talking about my insane amount of questions, and sometimes they're not necessarily that important or relevant. And I was thinking about how I used to study and take notes for things, and how I would just like literally write out word for word for lectures and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And so it's the same thing. It's, I don't know what I don't know if it's omniscience or whatever, but it's the same. There's the same error there of like, when you learn to acquire knowledge, you need to acquire everything. And like, I don't know, I can't quite identify it yet, but maybe it's an issue of essentials and not being able to find. The only way I formulated it is not being practiced in looking for that which is essential or most causally significant. So like if I'm listening to a lecture, to take an example from university, it would be writing down those things that would explain the most in what is being explained, in what is being talked about, and in ways that are like can be mentally compressed more effectively. But do you know if is there a word or concept for that? Is that rationalism, or what would that be? So I can look into that further.
For
constantly like for being too detailed, like in trying to when studying things in a way that's not even productive necessarily.
It's hard to describe what that is. It's something
empiricism?
Like concrete.
It wouldn't be rationalism, because it's like it's almost like empiricism. It's too concrete bound.
Yeah, I think it's too concrete bound. That you're focusing on just a wide variety of individual facts that aren't necessarily integrated. Or maybe it's a passive view that if you just absorb it, it'll integrate eventually.
Hard to say.
It is hard to say, but it is too much attention on too many individual facts or something like that. And you can't decentralize your thinking because you have everything in front of you. Nothing's being condensed or narrowed or abstracted away. It's just you have everything, and how do you keep that in your head if everything is just as it started? You have to integrate somehow.
It was interesting because I looked at all previous notes from lectures and stuff that I used to do, and that's exactly what I did. It's too much, and then I forget all of it anyway. So it's non-integration, but whatever the root cause is, I don't know. But anyway, it's interesting that was the same So it's something I'm now cognizant of. Um, let's see. I had some random questions here. On the topic of productivity, before we get back into virtue, like it talks about turning productivity includes the creation of a material value. But what about someone like a student, like who's learning or educating himself at school? Like what he's not creating a material value, right? Like he's taking exams or he's, reading fiction. Like there's nothing that is being created in the sense of productivity, right?
Um, yeah, I would say, yeah, it's just at that stage, it's all intellectual. It's just taking in ideas. It's not doing anything with those ideas. It's not altering the world or anything. So yeah,
Right.
it wouldn't be in itself productive. I mean, just doing all your notes and writing all your papers isn't necessarily productivity. Writing papers can be, but it depends on what your frame of mind is even. Like, are you using it as an objective to expand later productive goals? Is it a means to an end? For example, do you go to school so that you can acquire certain skills so that you can produce something with these ideas? Then that would be different. But
Right.
if you're, it's knowing what the reason you're doing it, you would call it unproductive. Either one, not doing the work anyway, so they couldn't get anywhere if you didn't succeed in school.
Yeah.
But even if you are succeeding in school, what are you planning to do with it? If you just want to keep thinking the rest of your life, well, that really doesn't, that wouldn't be productive.
Yeah.
He's like, I want a degree to think, and all I want to do is think. Well, by definition, you're not making anything.
Yeah.
You're
You're not going
just
to be
sitting there
productive. Yeah.
like a
Okay.
monk sitting there waiting for things to happen.
Yeah. Um, yeah, okay. I guess you could make a case then so there'd be periods in your life maybe where you're not necessarily productive because you feel that you need to acquire knowledge. Obviously with the view that the application or the productivity will come later. Do you reckon that makes
Yeah.
sense? Yeah,
Yeah,
okay.
you have to have that conscious awareness or you set conscious selection, what that goal, what you're going towards, rather than
Right.
just passive. I like thinking, so I'm going to do more of it.
Right.
Or I like school, so I'm just going to write more papers. And
Right.
if you have no purpose to it, nothing behind it other than the act of thinking, then no, it's
Then
not
I
productive.
Yeah, I agree. But then to look at it as simply as in you should always be productive and creating material values would be rationalist. Because obviously, there was that example of
Yeah,
like a student, is he not being independent if he goes to university and his parents help him? Like that's out of context. An out of context, that was the example given, that it was like an out of context view of the virtues, since the virtues they're not rules, they're principles you apply contextually, and their application will vary from scenario to
right.
scenario. And so same with productivity. And the motivation in asking the question was, yeah, because I have in mind in studying what I'm studying now and some other things I might study, I do have in mind that it's more of a theory that needs testing and experiment, that it will lead to the ability to then be more productive in a chosen pursuit and produce more. If you're better able to, if you can think better, you can communicate better, and but if you struggle in the first one, you feel that there's a big gap between what your level of thinking could be and what it is, then it does make sense to go, all right, well, let me then allot this period of time, even though I'm not exercising the virtue of productivity. I don't know if that's even framed correctly, but the point is, it's not an absolute thing where you're just like, I must produce a material value. That
Yeah,
would be a misunderstanding
production
of.
is in the context of the broad scheme of human life.
Right.
That you're not producing now is part of the process of producing later. It's a
Right.
development. The development is that you're starting with
Right.
developing thinking skills because thinking skills are essential to accomplishing your goals. You
Right.
can't accomplish any goals without any thinking, or you can't do them without self-esteem, or you can't do
Right.
that without a purpose. You're, it provides like you have both a purpose, but you're also developing how you get there.
Right. Yeah. Okay. I guess if it was true that productivity would mean constant production of material values, then you wouldn't be able to rest for 1 second because you're not.
Right.
But you have to factor in that as values are achieved over time and not an exercise
Right.
of it, virtues are exercised over time and not constantly nonstop. So
That's why we talk about the context of long-term thinking is the span of human life, like that your lifetime is that way of thinking, that we have to
okay,
recognize
right,
that
right,
these things are for the long-term flourishing, not just,
right.
you don't just put it in a box and say you must be productive on every single day at this exact moment. You have to understand the
That'd be like
context of,
the Bible. Yeah.
yeah, you'd have to understand the context of, or saying it's good or bad in the context of your entire span of life. So you have to apply, are you being productive in the long term? Are these things leading to productive activity? I
Yeah.
mean, just because you have a thought, then your brain sends out a signal and then your arm moves. It doesn't mean that, oh, you can't ever be productive, because there's always a moment where you're not always a moment where you're not enacting your idea.
Yeah. That would be, yeah, that's funny. That would be
I would
that.
almost bet somebody has argued that philosophically somewhere at some point. I bet somebody has that because of that moment, therefore concretes don't exist.
If I went to university and studied philosophy, maybe that would be something that
You'd be,
I'd get into. I'd find some little detail and I write an essay about it. Yeah, okay. All right, cool. That makes a lot of sense. Another random question have you read any Asimov, Isaac Asimov?
some.
Foundations.
I read
Thoughts?
Foundation.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Thoughts on Foundations?
I like the way he frames questions of AI and things like that. I don't
Yeah.
remember too much of the book. I do remember there's a psychohistory, and that was a very interesting idea that if you know the psychology of people, that you can predict the history of the world or something like that. Isn't that how it
Psychohistory.
went? It was a
I don't know.
concept within the book.
Oh, okay. Or you can predict the future, someone's future.
Yeah. And that's really problematic with free will, and makes it a really difficult thing to think about. Like, what if you did know how people think? Like, can you really predict something, or are people inherently random that they'll never be predictable? Like, is
Well,
there no amount of prediction possible?
is that not a um uh is that not assuming the premise of free will not having an identity? Because remember we discussed that one thing I was confused by was the nature of evil and how like someone couldn't just turn from you
Right.
knowing them and them being productive and honest to suddenly just becoming this rampaging murderer. And so there is a certain maybe a range of actions with which you can take with
Yeah.
free will, but that range is narrowed by the psychological history. What about that? Thinking about it that way, like I think I joined a chat what's it called, ARC, Ayn Rand Center UK, and they had a session on this, and someone gave the example of one of Leonard Peikoff's lectures. He says, if Ayn Rand decided one day she wanted to drift that day, would she snort cocaine? Like that was that was
Yeah.
Leonard Peikoff's question. I don't remember what the answer was, but I assume it was no. And so isn't that an example of like psychohistory then would not contradict free will? It would be an example of a range of choices and actions that are open rather than a specific path.
Yeah. I think that makes sense, what you're saying. Um, yeah, I think I don't remember too much of the book and how it was applied,
Right.
but I do know it's like a scientific approach to understanding human behavior, which of course is very psychological, but could be applied to predict human behavior. That can you predict the behavior of, say, large groups of individuals? Even if you could say, oh, your friend not going to suddenly switch from one to the other, but what can you say about general behavioral trends within a society? That's a very difficult question. And I mean, that's one thing to say like, oh, I know you're not gonna suddenly become a different person tomorrow. There is identity to your free will, but by putting all the individuals together of a large population, would we ever be able to predict that thinking? Or to what extent can we predict group behavior?
Isn't that relevant to economic questions?
Yes, I would say so.
Yeah, okay. All right, so it's got that in there. Yeah, and the reason I asked is I saw it come up a lot and I thought about reading it. So I'm
It's
always
interesting.
keen to look for. Yeah,
It's fun.
yeah.
It's a good sci-fi because it asks the right questions without being difficult to read and too much jargon, but
Right.
precise enough that it's actually having conceptual ideas to evaluate and to
Right.
criticize.
Right. The only other thing I just remembered now is on the topic of the movie that I watched. So I thought it was interesting as well that in the typically the I don't know if it's a cliche or what to call it, but it's burning books. Like if you've seen The Book Thief, the movie, at the beginning, they're burning books. But in this movie, in Equilibrium, they're burning art. And I thought that was it. That was it. That made me think like, okay, what would be the difference between burning art and burning books? Like keep books, burn art. I
It
couldn't
would
come to,
actually,
yeah.
just to make a comparison, that's like Plato's view about art. Plato did not think it was a good thing that
Really? You didn't think art
artists
was,
weren't good. He thought
okay.
philosophy was great, but art
Yeah.
was a no-no. His was that, say, craftsmen like imitate the world, but they used to accomplish some end. That they're not just imitating; they're still trying to understand the truth of things, like how do things work. So,
Right.
like whatever that might be, like it's not completely detached from the truth. But he thought that art was inherently illusory. That was always an illusion. That it takes you further from the truth, because not only is it an imitation, you're not trying. It's never exactly reality. So Plato thought like, oh, it took you further from reality, further from the truth. So it should be avoided that, at least it was non-virtuous, I guess you would say, that you can't get closer to the truth if you're an artist. Therefore, is bad poetry as well. And this is argued in the Republic. And at least in the Republic, which is pretty much a dictatorship, there's he's arguing the case that the citizens of the Republic should not like art, that they should not be encouraged to do art, that they should engage in things like craftsmanship or philosophy.
Yeah, that's interesting. And it's it's the same. There's a dictatorship. It's called the Tetragrammaton,
Yeah.
and it burns art. Although I guess the difference is that you can have a dictatorship as well, and they can burn books and not art. So it's not really a
Yeah.
consistent. It's not
Yeah,
a
but
consistent.
it with Plato, was like specifically art. I mean, like beyond literature. I mean, literature is one thing. You're burning books. Some of it's nonfiction, as you say, but rarely people would say that painting will destroy paintings and whatnot.
Yeah, yeah. That's why I found the idea interesting. You should destroy, like, yeah, it's different to just destroy art rather than books. Um, okay, let's see if there was anything else that I was. Oh, you were talking about your sense of life reaction as well to fiction, and so your focus is on reading the books with that you get a sense of life reaction from, and is that because I think you've said this earlier, but I can't remember. Is it because we talked about a couple of sessions ago how it helps you mature or whatever, but emotionally mature? Is it essentially because you discover yourself, as in you get the chance to introspect, and then you may be even given the words to understand what it is you're feeling or what is the value that you feel strongly for, because it might be given words in the abstract, or it might just be explained in a way that's concrete. So for example, remember that scene from Musashi I showed you, where there's this chinless samurai and he's like seeing this guy who's been killed, and then he reflects and says, he starts showing this concern for this man who's been killed and how life is so fragile. And then he realizes he doesn't have concern for the man, it's more concern for his own future. And so that's an example of like gives you psychological insight. Is that what you're referring to when you talk about reading a book with your sense of life reaction?
I think that's part of it, that you're reading it for what relationship it has with your life. And I think on some level that is your subconscious processes. Whatever goes on makes connections you might not be aware of that could even unify more ideas in your mind,
What,
relating what you see about reality to your reaction to the words on the page. That you're making connections that you might not realize
what do you mean?
subconsciously.
And how do you know you're making them if you don't realize?
What I mean to say is that, at least my view of the subconscious, for lack of a better word, is that it's a large association of memories. It really essentially would hold everything you can remember at all, that you could ever remember right now is,
Yeah.
and ever recall, is in your subconscious. And there are connections made with memories that can be enhanced or weakened over time just by, say, observing something or something like that. And I think it can react to certain aspects of the world in a way that it integrates information that you can become aware of.
Okay.
Is that making
That's
much
still,
sense?
I'd need an example of like how,
Okay.
what's a thing you've read where you've suddenly integrated information in a new way and you've used that as a, yeah.
Well, the easiest example I was shrugged, because I can think of many examples where my mind has been shifted just from reading it. I mean, like I always had views when I first read it, like, of being independent and oh, in particular, I could think of a scene where Dagny was at parties when she was younger. Like her mom told her to go and she didn't like them. She didn't like going at all.
Yeah.
And she just kind of did it because she had to. And she was like, I reacted in a positive way to that because, like, oh yeah, she's independent. That's cool. Or not even consciously, just like there's an appeal I feel just when I read that.
Yeah.
I might not even put it into words, but there's something I'm noticing and it appeals to me and it grabs my attention. I notice it as important. Like I flag it as this is important or I want to remember this or something like that. I mean, I might just do that on my own just because it interests me or just in the process of the strength of my reaction makes me want to think about it more. It motivates me to think about it more. It just gives that inner feeling of wanting to deal with it. And then I would say that in addition to that, whatever connections are made subconsciously or connections that are consolidated, modified, or changed over time without your awareness, I think that could make connections with related concepts, say maybe actually about independence rather than, oh, I'd like somebody who doesn't care, doesn't want to just go to a party just because of the social benefit or something like that. And it
Okay.
more, I would say, I had stronger connections with, say, what being independent or Dagny being like, oh, I should think in terms of um, like why I'm doing something, not just the consequences of it, but what was underneath it. So I'm not sure if those would necessarily be connections, but just from my reaction, I became more aware of those things. Like I was in pushed to think about it more, and I would think even that the aspects I'm not aware of impacted me too. Like say with independence and party going, like maybe I never considered connecting them, and I don't think I did explicitly either. But I was thinking about independence, and I was viewing like a position on party going, and I associated them perhaps, and that association could be strengthened with other concepts just because of just the interaction of concepts.
So the first part was there, there may be something in the book that there's some sentiment a character feels or shares that you have felt before and that is important to you. And so you remember it. And then in the process of going through and picking up all those little scenes where you feel something is important, if you can relate it back to an abstraction, which may not always be the case, because I think Atlas Shrugged is unique in some sense because there are all these like abstract speeches. But if you don't have that in a book, if you can relate whatever example or concrete or specific that you reacted to back to an abstraction, it helps you make concepts more real. That's what I got basically from what you said.
Yeah, but also that some of it goes on without your explicit direction of abstracting things. It's just like the more concepts you see associated, or the more times you see this way of thinking associated with, say, independence, or whether or not you're consciously telling yourself, I want to remember this, this is important.
Yeah.
Your subconscious or those processes that occur that you are not aware of, they are strengthening the connections between these concepts, and it strengthens them over time, and it be in such a way that once you consciously think of it, next time you'll actually think of it independence and you'll think of the concrete example, just because your subconscious has strengthened the connection between these concepts. And then once you identify it explicitly, then you're like making a new principle, or you're expanding you're making it into knowledge, not just some implicit thing, but you transformed it into something that you can think about, that can shape your thinking, that the connections that the subconscious made, now you can work with it. You can build something further from there.
But you're talking about the connection the subconscious made. Do you just mean because of the fact that it's an emotional experience, you remember it as an example? Is that?
I think some of that just
Okay.
happens anyway. The strength of emotion can just itself be a reason that a memory is formed.
Right.
Whether or not you intended it is just, is neurally represented. By that I just mean to say that there is something real that goes on that deals with these things you perceive, but you might not be able to be aware of each and every process going on of relating these ideas. So that's why it can be important to go by your sense of life reaction on what sort of books you want to read, because that process is strengthened if you, or whatever process goes on, is better enabled when you're doing things that your subconscious can engage with, the things that, it gets really complicated, but the point is that when you think about it, that your subconscious assists the connections you make, and it can only assist your memory if you engage in what's important to your subconscious, or you engage what you view as important. That will engage conscious.
Doesn't that take you down a path of just, let's say you want to shift things, like you're just further reinforcing whatever you've already got in your subconscious? Then if I like navigate through books based on my sense of life, for example, but let's say I only enjoy like The Underground Man from Dostoevsky, and I enjoy American Psycho, like what, I remember asking someone, but then wouldn't that just be reinforcing whatever it is that's already down there in some muck?
It could. I think that's why it's important to then introspect about what it is that is motivating you to read those things. Maybe you could be able to identify what it is you enjoy about it. Then you could evaluate, wait, should I direct my thinking elsewhere? And that sort of thing you might get. So
Okay.
you could alter it, I think, depending on the goal you have in mind of why you're reading things. I mean, your reading could be part of your development as a person, or your reading could be mere entertainment. So, I mean, you could just frame your thinking differently, and that will probably alter what sort of things you continue to watch or read.
Well, my primary takeaway from what you said is still the fact that if I read something and I have no emotional reaction whatsoever, I'll just forget it. So it was almost pointless. Like there may be one or two things that I can think about later, but the chances are that I'll do anything.
Yeah. Without it, it's very difficult with literature. I mean, I think it's different with nonfiction. Nonfiction has, maybe not necessarily, but if you're reading fiction with stories and a plot, no, I don't think you'll remember it unless you had some sense of life reaction. Otherwise, it's just like unimportant. There's nothing to encode about it. There's nothing to bother remembering.
Yeah.
I mean, even your mind would pick up on that anyway. You won't naturally try to remember it, so it won't help. But it might be different for nonfiction. May have a different argument, or it might be different if you're trying to learn it just didactically. Like, oh, this person presents their theory of something, so you read it, even if it's weird that it's fiction. But I mean, you're not trying to think of it as art. You might be able to extract knowledge from it, but you're not going to necessarily remember it well. Like if you want to remember a story and all that, it brings to your concrete thoughts and all the value of art and the cognitive function of art and the way it fuels your life even. Um, yeah, and if you had no reaction, there's nothing there.
Yeah.
There's nothing to build on or think about.
Do you generally know within like the first few pages if you're having a sense of life reaction?
Maybe I go up to 50 because
Oh,
I'm almost
okay.
masochistic about it, but I'm better at it. I can read 10 pages usually and know if I'm gonna like it.
All right, cool. Yeah. I've always wondered about that because I've tried a while back. I was trying to select books so I could have that reaction because I somehow knew that those were the books that would have affected me the most and often caused me to change my life in some way. And so my approach was just to read all these books off Amazon and constantly return them. But I'd read like the first 4 pages and just to see if anything happened. But it wasn't an effective strategy to find books that.
Sometimes I make a list of books I want to read, and like they
Yeah.
strike me as cool. Like, oh, I
Yeah.
like that concept, or I
Yeah.
disagree with that, but I want to think about that.
Mhm.
Well, I want to argue. I want to come up with every reason to say you're wrong. I want to read that book. Like
Yeah.
I felt that way about some philosophy books. Like I want to see what I hate about it.
Okay.
But even for fiction, like
Well,
I see
hate
a
is a
cool
reaction
premise.
too, though. Hate is
Yes.
like that was a feeling.
Yes. So I would say even with nonfiction, I have reactions, and I think that helps me remember things for sure.
Yeah, I was thinking about that earlier, actually, in relation to nonfiction, because if I'm kind of like working on something, like if I'm doing conceptual clarification and it feels super dry and uninteresting, then I also think maybe something's wrong because you don't necessarily remember what you're doing. Like there's some disconnect. Like you can say though it's important, but you just feel this glaze, and then
Yeah.
it's not useful anymore. But then you can't approach it in the same way as you do fiction. It's not like, I don't know if like if you study philosophy, you're not necessarily supposed to feel some overwhelming sense of like fascination or interest all the time.
Yeah.
So yeah, I don't know, thoughts on
Yeah,
that?
that's the
Like,
interesting thing about identifying what is art. Because even with philosophy works, anybody could tell you a difference. You could easily tell the difference between Musashi and Ito. Like there's almost no similarity practically. Like they're both books and they write stuff
yeah,
and they deal with abstract ideas, but why is there a different reaction to Musashi versus Ito? There's something, of course, special
well, I
about it.
mean, I guess that's just more broadly the question of the role of art, isn't it? Because
Yes,
when you react
and
to
sense of
Ito,
life.
there's more similarity to reacting to Ito and reacting to a whiteboard and reacting to some new concept than there is to reacting to Musashi or a
Yeah,
sculpture.
yeah. There's something about the representation of the world that seems to change things. That you start to have reactions when you incorporate things about the world or representations of the world. That when you bring in, like, say, even fantasy, you're bringing in something concrete, something with values related. Like, it's about values almost inherently, but nonfiction books aren't necessarily about, say, the value of, say, independence, like the virtue of independence. You would be, it's not so much things you pursue in life as much as just the abstractions, which aren't
Right,
necessarily themselves values. They're just abstractions, or
right.
not even necessarily viewed as important, which is part of your sense of life reaction.
What do you mean they're not viewed as important?
What I mean is,
on an emotional level, you mean?
Yeah, just on an emotional level, that
Okay.
the value that there is some value evaluation going on, but you might not still evaluate what is the nature of concept formation as like, oh, that's a value I really want to pursue. Like usually it's some part of understanding something else, or you don't purely value the concept. Or what I'm trying to say is that it's not purely about, when you're reading art, it's not purely about merely the concept you learn, but it's incorporation into your sense of life and relationship to your emotions that really changes the nature of it.
Incorporation of what into your emotions and
Um,
incorporation of the abstract concept?
or the concretes, really.
Okay.
Association
But
with the concretes and these ideas. It's not as direct, not as engaging to your emotions as, say, merely abstract thinking.
what can you maybe give me an example from like non-Atlas Shrugged where there's some shift that has caused you? Because Atlas Shrugged is I don't know if it's the best example because there are so many abstract speeches in there that try and integrate all the specific events, but in other books they don't. Obviously, a lot of other books won't have that, so they're almost a better example.
Are you talking about art
Yeah,
and fiction, or
art and fiction
okay?
causing like a shift in concepts without without all these abstract speeches.
Um, let's see. Books by Robert Heinlein. Um,
Yeah.
Say Stranger in a Strange Land is
Okay.
a pretty good one. He doesn't use these giant speeches or anything. He does use a fair amount of dialogue, but is nowhere near the extent Rand does.
Yeah.
And it goes on about, it changed my perspective on human relationships. It altered it really. Like it wasn't like instant when I read it, but it like pushed my mind differently. Like I started engaging subconsciously with certain ideas differently, both consciously and
Are
subconsciously.
you
Like
are you willing? Is it too personal to be specific? Because you don't have to share if it's, but it's pretty
yeah,
interesting.
it's
I'll write it down.
but it's a sort of book that's not necessarily big on these wide Rand style abstractions, but it
Right.
does deal with abstractions. It does deal with things that matter, and it is a bit fantastical, but not overboard. It's still sci-fi. It's nothing too wild, but
Yeah.
it's enough that just my sense of life reacting positively. I had a positive reaction to the book anyway,
Yeah.
regardless of the content I saw it. It almost made me more willing to think about certain ideas I might not have otherwise.
Like relationships or
Or just how
friendships.
to treat people, how you should
Okay.
treat your friends, and what's good about friendship, things like that.
Because it made you ask the questions. Is that what?
Yeah, or framed them in a different way, and I
Like
started to think differently,
what?
slightly. Not,
Can you be? Is there a specific thing you can think of where it
um,
was that made like?
yeah,
What
I
does it look
guess
like to frame it in a different way and then?
to think more loving of friends, I guess is a way to think of it. Like it's easy to get caught up in thinking of friends as more utilitarian things. Like you do
Yeah.
something for them, they do something for you,
Yeah.
and this is more. This was early on. Like I only known about objectives for 3 years at this point, so it incorporated into that too. Like they kind of influence each other. My thoughts
Right.
on objectivism and how you should treat people, like for your flourishing, not just because you have a duty, but there's some reason to do it, some selfish reason. And it shifted my
And
thinking a little bit. And I wasn't always thinking about these things explicitly, but
yeah.
I do know just by being introduced to this and having some emotional reaction that my mind can make associations, whether or not you say it's subconscious or not. I'm still making new associations that I might not have otherwise. And it was
Okay.
thanks to the art that I made, even felt motivated to make the connections. There's something about my life that seemed worthwhile, about human life that seemed worthwhile to think about it. Like it pushed me to have a reason to it, not just merely intellectually, but a motivation, a desire, a want. I can't think of the exact word to use, but it was critical to altering my way of the way I see the world.
That's really interesting. And would you say, would I be right in saying that it's because you have this emotional reaction and maybe there's a friendship that's portrayed differently from how you would have imagined it, but you react to it positively, and that's what triggers this kind of thought process? Like you see something different and you react positively. Is that would you say I've captured?
Yes.
Okay, I got it.
Yes.